There's an old saying out here that the soil remembers everything. It remembers the sweat of the men who broke it, the blood of the cattle that ran it, and the quiet prayers whispered into the wind during the long droughts. But what I learned is that the soil also remembers disrespect, and it has a funny way of rising up to meet those who think a property line is just a suggestion on a piece of paper. I marked my line in the dirt. I etched it in stone in memory, and they crossed it once, which was a mistake. But when they crossed it again, they didn't just answer to me. They answered for every single inch of ground they tried to steal. Tell the board at Pinecrest Heights that I don't believe in warnings, I believe in consequences. That was the thought running through my head the morning the world tilted sideways. On a day that started with the sun bleeding over the ridge of my property, Blackwood Creek, a 60-acre slice of heaven that's been in my bloodline since before the interstate was even a dream. I was out by the north gate, coffee in hand, listening to the mourning doves, when I saw it. A stark white envelope wedged between the weathered slats of my cedar fence. No postage, no name, just sitting there like a challenge. Inside, there was no letterhead, no polite introduction, just 12 typed words that hit me harder than a physical punch. The sanctuary expansion phase 4 cannot proceed unless the thorn parcel is vacated. And below that, 2 more words, step aside. It wasn't a request, it wasn't an offer, it was a command, delivered with the cold arrogance of someone who views my family legacy as a temporary inconvenience, like a coat draped over a chair they want to sit in. I stood there, the paper trembling slightly in the morning breeze, realizing that step aside is the sound a rattlesnake makes before it strikes, quiet, efficient, and deadly. I walked my fence line that morning, looking for tire tracks, boot prints, anything. But the ground was undisturbed, which meant whoever left this knew how to move like a ghost or a thief, and that settled a cold weight in my chest, because threats that come in silence are always the ones you have to worry about. The next morning, the silence broke. I was fixing a latch on the cattle pen when I heard it, a low, electric hum, followed by the crunch of gravel that didn't sound like a farm truck. So I walked to the perimeter, and there they were, 3 men standing on the wrong side of my fence, dressed in khakis that had never seen dirt, holding laser rangefinders and tablets. They didn't knock, they didn't wave, they were just pointing lasers at my barn like they were measuring it for a demolition, and one of them, a guy with a haircut that cost more than my weekly grocery bill, leaned over and planted a neon orange flag right in the middle of my driveway. "Morning," I said, letting the word hang heavy in the air, but they didn't turn, didn't even flinch, which told me everything. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as an obstacle to be removed. Finally, the tall one looked up, tapped his screen, and said, "Boundary verification for the sanctuary, phase 4 future alignment, shouldn't take long," as if he was ordering a coffee. "Future alignment?" I asked, walking closer, leaning my arms on the wood that my grandfather cut by hand. "This isn't Pinecrest land, and it sure as hell isn't part of any sanctuary." The tall man gave me that pitying smile, the kind lawyers use before they gut you, and said, "We are operating within the public easement for assessment. Sir, if you don't move, phase 4 dies, and there is too much momentum for that to happen. If I don't move, phase 4 dies." That was the slip, the crack in the armor. He didn't whisper it. He said it with the confidence of a man backed by millions of dollars. And as they packed up their shiny white SUV with temporary plates and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and that orange flag, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an invasion. 2 days later, the heavy artillery arrived, not in a tank, but in a polished black sedan that looked terrified of the gravel road. Out stepped a man who introduced himself as Marcus Sterling, representing Zenith Corp., the developers behind the HOA expansion, and he walked up my porch steps like he owned the wood beneath his feet. He was all smiles and firm handshakes, talking about opportunities and greenbelt transition zones, words that are just fancy wrappers for theft. He slid a glossy folder across my outdoor table, opening it to reveal a map that made my blood run cold, because there, printed in high-definition color, were cul-de-sacs, decorative ponds, and townhomes, all sitting exactly where my cattle graze, exactly where my parents are buried. "We have investors lined up," Sterling said, tapping the map. "The board has already signed preliminary agreements regarding the boundary adjustment. We just need to finalize the acquisition of the thorn parcel." Acquisition? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You speak like it's already done. Well, he hesitated, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. The HOA informed us that negotiations were favorable. And there it was, the lie that started the war. The Pinecrest Heights HOA had sold my land, my 60 acres, to a massive developer before they even asked me if I wanted to sell. They had taken checks, signed contracts, and promised delivery of property they didn't own. I pushed the contract back to him, staring him dead in the eye, and said, "Next time you want to sell my land, you better bring the deed, and since you don't have it, get off my porch." Sterling's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian stare, and he said, "Mr. Thorne, there is a lot of money involved here, and people with money don't like to be told no. I suggest you reconsider before the HOA is forced to take other measures." He drove away, but the dust hadn't even settled before the other measures arrived. The following evening, a convoy of SUVs rolled up to my gate, led by a woman I recognized from the local papers, Patricia Vance, the president of the Pinecrest HOA, a woman who wore pearls like combat armor and looked at the world with permanent disappointment. She was flanked by a guy wearing a community safety uniform that looked like he bought it at a costume shop, and she didn't ask to come in. She just stood at the gate and announced, "We are here to discuss your non-cooperation with the community integration plan." "I'm not in your community, Patricia," I said, leaning against my truck, "and my land isn't for integration." She sighed, a theatrical, long-suffering sound, and said, "The HOA has the authority to petition the county for condemnation if a property poses a structural or environmental risk to the development. We can do this the easy way, or we can find a reason to make it the hard way." It was a threat, plain and simple, a promise that if I didn't sell, they would frame me, sabotage me, or sue me until I drowned. As they turned to leave, the fake cop sneered and said, "You're fighting the future, old man." And I just stood there, watching their taillights fade into the twilight, feeling the rage settle into something cold and hard in my gut. They thought they were dealing with a scared rancher who would buckle under the weight of letterhead and legal threats. They thought they could redraw the map, and I would just fade away. But they didn't know that when you push a man who has nothing left but his land, you don't get compliance, you get a war. And as I looked at the dark outline of my fence, I knew the time for talking was over. The paperwork assault began the next morning, and it was relentless, a blizzard of white envelopes stuffing my mailbox until the metal door wouldn't close. I sat at my kitchen table, slashing them open with a pocket knife, reading accusations that would have been funny if they weren't so dangerous. Fence height inconsistent with visual harmony, improper livestock containment, exterior structures posing fire hazards. They were hitting me with everything, trying to bury me in administrative fines and county inspections, trying to bleed my bank account dry so I'd have to sell just to survive. But the most chilling letter wasn't from the HOA. It was a notification from the county planning department, stating that Pinecrest Heights had filed a petition to review environmental concerns on the Thorne parcel, requesting temporary conditional access for assessment. They were weaponizing the government against me, using safety codes as a crowbar to pry open my gates so they could march their surveyors in and legitimize their theft. I sat there, surrounded by these stacks of lies, and I realized something crucial. They were in a rush. The sheer volume of harassment, the desperation in Patricia Vance's threats, the fact that Zenith Corp had already pre-sold the lots on my land. It all meant they were on a deadline. If they didn't secure my land soon, their house of cards would collapse, investors would walk, and lawsuits would fly. They needed to intimidate me into submission, and since the legal threats were taking too long, they decided to get their hands dirty. I spent that afternoon preparing, not for a legal battle, but for a tactical one. I went to the old shed and dug out my storm gear, which was really just a collection of hunting tools I hadn't used in years, high-definition trail cameras, motion-triggered floodlights, and a canister of UV tracer powder, the kind used to track wounded game in the dark. My father used to say, "If you want to catch a thief, don't look for him, let him look for you." I rigged the perimeter like a fortress. I hid cameras and hollowed out logs and birdhouses, pointing them at the weak points in the fence. I wired motion sensors to the floodlights, but kept the bulbs unscrewed for now. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted them to get comfortable crossing the line. Then, I sprinkled the UV powder along the game trails and the drainage ditch, the exact spots a sneak would use. To the naked eye, it looked like dust, but under a blacklight, it would glow like radioactive waste, and once it gets on your clothes, it doesn't come off without a fight. That night, the air was thick, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I sat in the dark of my kitchen, watching the monitors, waiting. Around 1 a.m., the first sign appeared, not a person, but a drone. It hovered over my barn, a blinking red eye in the sky, mapping, watching, invading. I didn't shoot it down, though my finger itched on the trigger. I needed them to think I was asleep, defeated. 20 minutes later, the trail cam at the North Ridge pinged. Two figures, dressed in dark hoodies and carrying backpacks, slipped under the wire. They moved with purpose, not like kids pulling a prank, but like professionals. I watched on the screen, my heart hammering a slow, cold rhythm against my ribs as they knelt by the property line. One of them pulled out a metal stake and drove it into the earth. Clink, 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 the sound of iron violating my soil. They were planting false boundary markers. They were physically moving the line in the middle of the night so that when the county inspectors came the next day, the environmental assessment would happen on what they claimed was their land. I waited until they were deep in the trap, kneeling right in the patch of UV powder I'd laid near the irrigation shed. Then, I hit the switch. Flash. The floodlights I had rescrewed earlier exploded into life, bathing the pasture in blinding white light. On the screen, the two men scrambled like cockroaches, shielding their eyes, stumbling over each other. They didn't know which way to run, blinded by the sudden shift from pitch black to noonday sun. They panicked, dropped a clipboard, and bolted for the fence, slipping through the wire and disappearing into the woods of the Pinecrest development. I didn't chase them. I walked out into the cool night air, picked up the clipboard they dropped, and shone my UV flashlight on the ground. The footprints were there, glowing a brilliant, undeniable purple, trailing all the way from the fence to the stake they had planted. I pulled the stake out of the ground. It was heavy, steel, and stamped on the side were the words, Sanctuary Phase 4, Boundary Verified. And clipped to the stake was a laminated map, stamped, pending final approval, showing my entire ranch erased, replaced by townhomes. I stood there under the stars, holding the evidence of their crime, and I realized I had them. But I wasn't just going to win a court case. I was going to burn their entire operation to the ground. I didn't need to convince the HOA to stop. They were zealots, true believers in their own power. I needed to scare the money. I spent the next morning compiling a package. High-resolution photos of the trespassers, the glowing footprints, the drone footage, the stamped stake, and the map. I wrote a letter, not to Patricia Vance, but to the legal department of Zenith Corp and their primary investors. The letter was simple. You have purchased land that is not for sale. Your partners are forging boundaries and trespassing to cover up their fraud. I have video evidence, forensic proof, and I am prepared to go to the press and the police. This is your only chance to walk away before you become accomplices. I drove into the city, wearing my dusty ranch clothes, and walked into the corporate glass tower of Zenith Corporation. I didn't ask for a meeting. I slapped the thick manila envelope onto the receptionist's marble desk and said, "Delivery for legal. Tell them the Thorn property isn't a transition zone. It's a minefield." I walked out, feeling the adrenaline vibrate in my fingertips. I had lit the fuse, and now, all I had to do was wait for the explosion. But Patricia and her cronies weren't done yet, and before the end, they would try one last, desperate push to break me. The waiting is always the hardest part of hunting, but I didn't sit idle. After I dropped that bomb at Zenith Corp, the atmosphere at Blackwood Creek shifted from anxious to ominous. The HOA must have sensed the walls closing in because the harassment stopped being bureaucratic and started getting psychological. I decided to turn my property into a haunted house. I set up old fog machines I used for brush burn training along the fence line, pumping a low, creeping mist that spilled over into their manicured lawns at night. I hooked up low-frequency speakers in the trees, playing a sound just on the edge of hearing, a deep, vibrating hum that causes unease and nausea. I put up new signs, official-looking ones that said, "Warning, Biohazard Decomposition Zone," and "Active Federal Investigation." I watched from my porch as curious neighbors and HOA spies approached the fence, only to hit that wall of fog and sound, stopping dead in their tracks, looking at my land like it was cursed. Fear is a powerful tool. It makes people question their leaders, and I could see the cracks forming in Serenity Ridge. Then the summons came. Pinecrest Heights was suing me for obstruction of development and seeking an emergency injunction to seize the land. Patricia Vance was doubling down, betting everything on one last roll of the dice in court. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old lies. Patricia was there, looking pale but defiant, sitting next to a lawyer who looked like he was sweating through his expensive suit. Judge Holloway, a stern man with no patience for nonsense, peered over his glasses as Patricia's lawyer droned on about community progress and verbal agreements. "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, "Mr. Thorne is impeding a multi-million-dollar project based on antiquated boundary claims. We have surveys proving." "Stop," I said, standing up. "I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't need one. Your Honor, those surveys are forgeries created by trespassers in the middle of the night." Patricia gasped, playing the victim perfectly. "That is a lie. We are a respectable organization." "May I?" I asked the judge, holding up a USB drive. He nodded. The screens in the courtroom flickered to life. The video played. The drone, the hooded men, the stake being driven into the ground. You could hear a pin drop. Then came the flash of light, the panic, the scrambling. But the kill shot was next. "Your Honor, if you could dim the lights?" I asked. The bailiff flipped the switch, plunging the room into gloom. I pulled out my UV flashlight and aimed it at the evidence table where I had placed the stake and the surveyor's vest that Patricia's safety officer had carelessly left behind in his rush to escape. I'd found it snagged on the barbed wire the next morning. The beam hit the fabric, and it lit up with glowing purple handprints. Smears of luminescent gilt. "That is tracer powder," I said, my voice echoing in the silence. "And it proves that Pinecrest agents illegally entered my land to falsify these boundaries." Patricia looked like she was going to be sick. Her lawyer closed his briefcase, effectively resigning on the spot. But the final nail in the coffin came from the back of the room. The heavy oak doors swung open, and a man in a charcoal suit walked in. It was the head of legal for Zenith Corp. "Your Honor," the man said, ignoring Patricia entirely. "My client, Zenith Corp., is formally withdrawing from all contracts with Pinecrest Heights effective immediately. We were misled regarding the ownership of the Phase 4 parcel. We are also filing a countersuit against the HOA for fraud and breach of contract." Patricia slumped in her chair, a ruin of a woman. The judge banged his gavel, dismissing the case with prejudice and ordering a criminal investigation into the HOA board. The walk out of the courthouse felt like floating. I didn't look back at Patricia, who was sobbing into her hands while her former allies scrambled away from her like she was contagious. A week later, the signs at the entrance of Pinecrest were changing. The future home of Phase 4 billboard was torn down, replaced by nothing but open air. Patricia resigned and moved away in shame. The neighbors, the ones who had glared at me, started waving when they drove by, realizing that I hadn't just saved my land. I'd saved them from a board of tyrants who would have eventually come for them too. I rode my horse out to the western ridge that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. The land was quiet again. No drones, no surveyors, just the wind in the cedar trees and the smell of the earth. I had won. The line held. But as I sat there, looking at the scar in the earth where their fake stake had been, I couldn't help but wonder. I fought for my property, for my heritage, and I was right to do it. But we live in a world where a piece of paper and a bank account can almost erase a man's entire existence. Justice didn't come because the system worked. Justice came because I was willing to turn my home into a war zone to defend it. It makes you ask the question, in the end, do we really own the land, or are we just fighting to hold on to it for a little while before the next developer with a bigger checkbook comes along? They say good fences make good neighbors. But I say a good fence is the only thing standing between a free man and a world that wants to swallow him whole. And my fence? It's never coming down.